Well, welcome back. The purpose of this second presentation is to give you an overview of phonetics and phonology. The readings that you want to pay attention to related to this are Chapter 6 out of Pinker's book, I think The Sound of Silence, I think it's called, and the chapter by Joanna Leboff out of the book Language in the Real World, which is up on Blackboard. Those are really the content of this unit, but to fully understand, especially the Leboff chapter, I want to give you an overview of what's called the International Phonetic Alphabet, or the IPA, and that's going to be what we end up focusing on in this talk. As you listen to the rest of this lecture, I'd recommend that you have a copy of the IPA chart handy. Now, I've got the full chart up on Blackboard. You can take a look at that if you want, but there are a lot of symbols on that chart that we're never going to use in this class. There's a lot more than we need. A more streamlined version is on page 47 of the Leboff article. You might want to take a look at that, have that handy as you're going forward with this presentation so that you can refer back to it. The chart out of the Leboff chapter really has just about everything that you're going to need for this course, so that's probably a more handy one. I wanted you to have the full one just as a reference, but I think the one on page 47 is probably your best bet. So then phonetics and phonology are both, in some sense, the study of the sounds of language. And what differentiates them is what aspect of the sound of language they look at. Phonetics really looks at the actual sounds that are coming out of your mouth. There's articulatory phonetics that studies how sounds are produced, and acoustic phonetics that studies how sounds resonate and how they're transferred. We're not going to worry about that distinction in this course, and we'll just say that phonetics deals with the actual sounds of language. If you recall from the previous lecture, the distinction that Saussure made between parole and langue, phonetics is kind of like parole in that it's the actual sounds of language. Phonology, which I'll say something about in a minute, is really more about the systems. But why should you pay attention to the actual sounds of language? Well, one reason is that the actual sounds of language are quite different than what we think it makes up language, and what we hear in our heads. I'll give you a couple examples of that. If you hold your hand up in front of your mouth and you say the word top, you'll feel a couple puffs of air. One of them comes right after the initial T, and that puff of air is called an aspiration. Aspiration is just something that we do when we pronounce a T, a P, or a K at the beginning of a syllable when it comes with a vowel right after it. It's just something we do in English. It's an accident of the pronunciation. Now, there are other languages where whether you have an aspirated sound or not makes a difference in meaning, but in English it doesn't make any difference, and therefore we don't hear it. Phonetics doesn't care about what we hear. It pays attention to what sounds are produced. And so phonetics will tell you that there's an aspiration after the T in the word top. But interestingly, not in the word stop. If you hold your hand up in front of your mouth and you say the word stop, you'll still feel a puff of air after the P, but not after the T. And that's something else phonetics would notice. A second example of things that you say without probably realizing it is if you pronounce the school Clemson. If you say it like a good Southerner and you say Clemson, you put a P in there, and there's no P in the word if you look at it. Sometimes people from up north will pronounce it Clemson with a Z, and there's also no Z in there. Phonetics would highlight the difference between Clemson and Clemson and maybe, I guess, the way it's quote-unquote supposed to be pronounced, which would be Clemson, which is, it's really hard to say, and no one in their right mind actually says that. So phonetics pays attention to what's the sounds that are being produced there. Phonology, on the other hand, studies not just which sounds are being produced, but which sounds that are produced actually make a difference within a language, and then which sounds don't make a difference. I mentioned on the last slide that we've got the aspiration after T's sometimes in English, but in fact we have actually 6 different ways at least to pronounce I guess I'll call it the letter T for now in English. I mentioned the aspirated top as in top, and then non-aspirated as in stop. You can see the letters in brackets there. Letters in brackets are phonetic symbols indicating the actual sounds, and the superscript H after the T indicates the aspiration. Alright, so that's 2 ways that we pronounce a T in English. But also, we'll sometimes not release the air at the end of the T at all. So if you say the word pot, and sort of leave yourself dangling there at the end, you still hear it as a T, but if you talk into a microphone and display on a computer the graph of the sounds coming out of your mouth, there's a pretty significant difference between an aspirated T, an unaspirated T, and then a closed off T, which is this third item here. There's also something called a flap, and in particular, this is an alveolar flap, and you'll see that on the chart, at least on the full IPA chart. I don't think it's on the chart in Leboff's book, in Leboff's chapter, excuse me. The middle sound in the word like little or ladder spelled with T's or D's, they're pronounced the same. We hear it as a T, but it's actually acoustically it's something different. We can sometimes pronounce a T as what's called a glottal stop. That's when you stop the sound in the back of your throat, like as in the word kitten, right? There's a stop there, almost like a hiccup. You can say kitten, but it sounds a little formal, a little stuffy. Most people, if they're speaking normally or casually, at least in American dialects, will say kitten with a stop in your throat there, that glottal stop. And there are some times when in normal speech you'll pronounce a T by not pronouncing anything. For instance, if you say the word hunter, there's no T at all in that word, although it's there in our brains, we're just not actually realizing it. So phonology would look at these 6 ways of pronouncing T and say, okay, acoustically, phonetically they're different, but in terms of the difference they make in your language, they're not different. They're all what are called allophones of the sound T. And phonology looks at how the sounds are grouped together, which different sounds matter, which different sounds aren't really different in any sense. And this brings us to the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. The readings you've done, and just from your own common sense, you know about the problems with English spelling in terms of conveying how a word is pronounced through the sound system. English spelling is notoriously bad, although Pinker has some nice things to say about it, and I think he's right about that. Still, there's a big difference between the way that we spell words and the ones and the actual sounds. Again, these are the consonants from the IPA chart, and again, I've put this chart up on Blackboard for your references. You can see a lot of these symbols will look familiar, and they will look like English letters, because a lot of them are English letters, but a lot of them are not familiar. And so I want to go through now what are some of the sounds in English that show up in the International Phonetic Alphabet less familiar, or sounds that might be less familiar. So we've got the theta and this is the th sound, as in thigh or ether. And next to that on the chart is you can call it a thorn, as in thy or either. And if you take the words thy and thigh or ether and either and say them, you can hear that the only thing difference is that one sound. Otherwise, they're all the same. So those are the sounds for usually it's spelled th. The sh sound, as in shy or motion, is unfamiliar. You will sometimes see this as an S with a little caret over the top of it, but I'll be using this symbol. This one is zh, as in measure or rouge. Then we have some sounds that are combinations of sounds. If you say t and sh and say them very quickly together, you get what we call the ch sound in English, as in church or etch. Similar to that, but slightly different, is the j sound, and as in judge or edge. And again, if you say etch and edge, one right after the other, you can really hear the difference between the ch and the j there. This symbol, I don't think Leboff puts this on her chart, but it is on the full IPA chart. This is not an X the way we use it in English. It's an X. It's a velar fricative, as in the German name Bach, or some pronunciations of Hanukkah, right? It's not a sound we have in English, but it's one you'll sometimes see in exercises, so I wanted to draw your attention to it, and specifically to be aware of that it's not a x sound, it's a ch sound. Not all dialects of English have a voiceless W. Of course, the thing that looks like a W is a W, and that's familiar, that's no problem. Some dialects have a voiceless W. And I'll talk about voice in a second, but you'll sometimes see this written in words like what or while. Not something that you really need to be super familiar with. It is on Leboff's chart, but I want you to recognize it in case you come across it in your reading. One thing that can cause confusion for some English speakers is the y. It's not a j, it's a y, as in yes or as in million. And then last is the sound, as in the word sing. Some people will pronounce a G on the end of the word and say sing, but most English speakers, most dialects of English will just say sing without a G on the end of it. And so that's that sound. You'll also hear that word in think. It's not technically it's an N, it's actually a velar nasal, but we'll say more about that in a second. So if you look at the IPA chart, the symbols are not grouped randomly. They're grouped in order. They're grouped according to a logical order by place, manner, and voicing. And for the next couple slides, I want to talk about what that means. For a second, just pronounce the sounds p, and b, and think about what part of your mouth are you using. And if that answer is not immediately clear, think about the sounds s, k, and h. Right? For p, and b, you notice you're using your lips for all three of those sounds. And for s, k, and h, you're not using your lips. You're using either the middle or the back of your mouth. And in the case of h, it's a throat. So this really gets at the idea of place of articulation, the place in your mouth where the sounds are articulated. So p, and b are what are called bilabials or sometimes just labials because they use your lips. So there are different places of articulation that you should be aware of. The labials, or bilabials sometimes, as I've mentioned. The labiodentals, where your lips and your teeth are both involved. If you say a f or a v, you notice you put your top teeth on your bottom lip. The dentals, sometimes you'll see them called the interdentals, the f and the v, right? That's with your tongue slightly between your teeth. Alveolars are articulated at the alveolar ridge, which is kind of in the top of your mouth, but not all the way in the top, a little front of that. If you feel with your tongue the division between the hard and the soft palate, you can feel that's basically where you articulate the t and the d and the flap and the s, z, n, l, and And then a little bit behind that are sounds like sh, zh, and ch, and j. The sound y is what's called a glide, and it starts at the very top of the mouth, the palate, and so it's called a palatal sound. And then sounds that are in the back of the mouth near the velum are called k, g, ng, and then the voiceless w, and then w. And then finally, there's the sounds that are made with the glottis, the glottal stop we talked about, which is kind of like the hiccup in your throat, and then the sound h, or just h, which is made just by passing air through the throat. Another way that the IPA chart groups up sounds is not just by the place of the articulation, but the manner of articulation. In other words, how does the mouth obstruct the flow of air as it's pronouncing a consonant? All consonants involve some sort of obstruction of the airflow, but how that air is obstructed affects the sound of the consonant. So for instance, in some letters, some sounds, the air stops completely. P, b, t, d, k, k. Right? That's a complete obstruction of air and then a release. Some sounds that are called fricatives, and that means there's friction, but the air doesn't stop completely. And these are sounds that you can pronounce for a long time. You can say v, for example, but you can't elongate a B sound any longer than an instant b, right? Because it relies on the air stopping and releasing. Fricatives involve friction or a flowing of the air. Affricates, and here's where you need to be following along with the chart. Affricates are combinations of stops and fricatives. So ch, for instance, is a combination of the T and the sh sound, ch. Nasals, no surprise, are articulated with the nose, and if you look at the chart, you can see the nasals are going to be the n, and the right? They're in a single row on the chart, whichever chart you're looking at. There are a couple other manners of articulation, but I'm not going to worry about those too much. Laterals and approximates, those are kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to be doing in this course. And then finally, consonants are also grouped according to whether they're voiced or not. Voicing refers to whether your vocal folds are vibrating. If you put your fingers lightly on the side of your throat while you pronounce s and z, you'll notice that your throat is vibrating for the z, but not for the s. right? The vibration is in your vocal folds, and that's voicing. Some sounds are voiced, some sounds are voiceless. On the IPA chart, whether it's the one from the Leboff chapter or the full chart, when two consonants are in the same box, the one that's on the left is voiceless, meaning the vocal folds are not vibrating, it's unvoiced. And on the one on the right is voiced, meaning it engages the vocal cords. Vowels tend to be a little bit trickier, but you can read them off the chart based on the same principles. If you look at the full vowel chart, which I've got here, you'll see there's a lot more vowels than we have in English. Although English has a pretty robust system of vowels, we have a decent number compared to some other languages. They're grouped by the location, whether it's your mouth is closed or open, whether the vowels are articulated in the front of the mouth, or the back of the mouth, and also whether your lips are rounded or not. I'm less concerned for this course about vowels, but I do want to draw your attention to the vowel symbols that you'll be using and that I want you to be able to recognize. So the vowel symbols that you need to recognize are these. There's what we would call in English a lowercase I is a seat, the E sound as in seat. And if you've taken Spanish or to some degree French, the sounds of these vowels will be familiar. They're quite different from what we have in English, but they're pretty standard across Romance languages and some other languages too. So E, then there's a I as in sit, which has it looks like a capital I. So there's E, I, A as in sate, E as in set, A as in sat, U as in suit, U as in soot, O as in soat, and I realize that soat is not a word, but just for comparison I wanted to keep the words similar, so soat or boat, or it's what we call sometimes when we're learning our letters the long O sound, O. Aw as in sought. Now I should tell you that some dialects of English don't have this sound anymore. So for instance, sought and sot might be pronounced the same, or caught as in I caught him red-handed, and cot as in they put up a cot for me to sleep on. Some dialects of English would pronounce those both as cot. In my dialect of English, I do have the aw sound. In fact, it's in my name. So it's out there, but it may be hard for some people to hear because some speakers may not have that vowel. And then there's the ah sound, as in sot or pot or cot, as the example I just gave. There's as in sudden, and I believe this is on Leboff's chart. Yes, it is, as a low mid back vowel. This is the sound when it's emphasized, as in sudden or hut. There's also the schwa sound, which you've probably seen in dictionaries. It's an unstressed neutral vowel just in the middle of the mouth, as in the first syllable in about or the second syllable in sofa. Those vowels are technically called monophthongs because they consist of one sound. A lot of English vowels, especially in the South, are actually diphthongs, meaning they're a combination of two different sounds. So for instance, if you say ah and ya together, I, and you run them together, it produces what we call the long I sound in phonics sometimes. You'll see it written as either of the ways that I have it there, but this is the sound as in mice. The vowel O plus the glide, oi. Sometimes it's written the second way with the O and then the I, as in moist. Now English speakers, again, we hear these as single vowels because we treat them as phonemes. They're a single sound in the system of our language, but phonetically they're distinct sounds. There's aw, or another way that it's sometimes written down is the aw there, as in excuse me, I've mispronounced that. That's ow.